Welcome, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In this segment, we're going to be discussing Donald Trump scolding the South Koreans for paying, quote-unquote, virtually nothing for U.S. protection. Officials are saying that the president, i.e. Donald Trump, is fuming that South Korea is not doing more to, in fact, contain Pyongyang's perceived aggression. Now, this is certainly a reversal of how the U.S. has acted towards its ally, South Korea, in the past, with the president now seemingly, at least, siding with North Korea, even downplaying its recent missile tests, saying that they are not, in fact, in flagration or against what was agreed upon between Trump and Kim, saying, of course, as this is Donald Trump's statement, that this was only in violation of UN resolutions. So let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're joined now by John Lyman, who is a political analyst. He is the editor-in-chief of the International Policy Digest. He is joining us now from the South Korean capital, Seoul. John, what do you make of Donald Trump's statements? I imagine at some level they're being met with a bit of confusion in Seoul.
They are. Thank you for having me. I think you take his comments with a grain of salt in the context that you take his position with NATO not paying enough. You take it with with a grain of salt, unless it's a tangible. Unless it's something tangible that Trump can put his hands on, he tends to treat everything as transactional in foreign policy, especially U.S. foreign policy. So with him undercutting, he's essentially undercutting Seoul's security at the moment, and as well as Japan's security with these tweets. But they are just tweets. Official U.S. policy is still to defend the Korean Peninsula against North Korean aggression. So I think South Korean officials need to parse out his tweets and actually official U.S. policy. Now, John,
but then if I may, John, for a moment, it's not just tweets, is it? Because Trump pushed for South Korea to pay more for what he has called U.S. protection. In fact, he's asked for the South Koreans to pay twice so far, and apparently he's succeeded both times.
And he has. And South Korea's agreed to pay, I think, in the area of almost $900 million, which is an 8% increase from the previous year, which is substantial considering the size of the South Korean economy. It's not as vast as the U.S. or even China's economy, so it is a significant amount of money. And the total cost of the U.S. to keep ground forces in Korea is, I think, close to $5 billion. So agreeing to pay $900 million is still pretty significant. But the U.S. is actually pushing for the full amount, which I think is unrealistic. In anyone's view, it's unrealistic. So for him and he has been successful in pressuring the Koreans to pay more. So it's been, he's had some success in that, but even NATO members, when he pressured NATO to increase defense spending, not all the members have agreed to increase it.
So then, one of the interesting things that's coming out of this is that their letter has been received apparently by the U.S. president from Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, and Kim complains about the U.S. South Korea military drills, and of course that's been a long standing complaint on the part of Pyongyang. And Trump in many ways says that he agrees with that, actually, saying that he doesn't see the need for all of the above military drills. And again, going back to the payment issues, he complains again that South Korea isn't doing its part as far as paying up for that sort of U.S. protection. Do you think that North Korea in some way has been successful in creating a wedge between these two allies?
Yeah, Kim Jong-un has been very effective at flattering Donald Trump, something the South Koreans haven't really done a very good job at, because Trump is a very, he's not a weak person, but he tends to respond to flattery quite well. It's something that Theresa May did. It's something that the British royal family did. So if you want to grease the wheels, you have to show a bit of flattery towards a man. And Kim Jong-un has done that. But let's look at the military drills. The vast military drills were scaled back between the U.S. and South Korea, but the most recent drills are I think computer games. So they aren't conventional military drills how we would envision them to be. So Kim Jong-un has been successful, but only to a point. The sanctions are still in place, and the U.S. isn't really normalizing relations that much with Kim Jong-un and the Korean government in the north. So he's been successful in the way to undermine U.S.-South Korea relations, but considering that Donald Trump isn't going to be in office permanently, perhaps only a few more years, that's very long, short term. Any North Korean gains that they get from it.
You know, it's interesting, John, that South Korea has just appointed a new ambassador to the U.S. and Ambassador Lee, once he's confirmed, I imagine, has in the past described Donald Trump as treacherous. And I imagine this possibly isn't a mistake on the part of the South Koreans, or do you think this is just a coincidence that the South Koreans would, at this time, be appointing somebody who is that critical of a sitting U.S. president?
Well, globally, I think if you look at any world leaders, I'm sure they've said unflattering things about the president. Even Boris Johnson criticized Trump several years ago when he was running for president. So even if it was a mistake or intentional, it's who they've nominated. And it's doubtful that Donald Trump, after the incident with the UK ambassador, is willing to disparage him and force him into retirement. So I think it probably was an unintentional slight on the part of the South Koreans, to nominate this man.
Yeah. All right, so then where does this leave, basically, any chances for meetings going forward between the North Koreans and the U.S., do you think? And then where does this leave the South Koreans, and as you mentioned correctly, the Japanese as well? It seems that Abe, at the very least, has been able to position himself fairly well when it comes to Trump. So do you think that in some ways that aspect will help even the South Koreans vis-a-vis their national interests?
I think structurally nothing's really fundamentally changed. Trump is planning on meeting Kim Jong-un again, but that seems to be Donald Trump's fallback diplomatic move to meet Kim Jong-un, the same as to meet Vladimir Putin of Russia and other world leaders who perhaps are not the most friendly to U.S. interests. But I think in the end, South Korea, its position will still be the same, more or less. It will agree to pay more in defense, and the U.S. will continue to maintain troops here. But Abe, he's currently engaged in this diplomatic face-off with South Korea, which isn't necessarily helpful for South Korea. But I think Abe is in a stronger position because of it, because he's been able to grease the wheels with Donald Trump, with flattery, visiting him at the Mar-a-Lago Country Club, bringing him golf clubs. So I think Abe is in probably a stronger position than Moon, because Moon is only in office for a few more years. So the South Koreans are aware of the fact that they need probably a stronger president in a few years.
And that's a good point, in fact, to ask you about the legacy of Moon and all of this, because Moon came into office, didn't he, wanting peace on the Korean Peninsula and peace between the North and South. Why do you think he's failed in that regard?
Well, a lot of it has to do with economics. The Korean economy is built in such a way that it's very dependent on a few major corporations, Samsung, Hyundai, a few others. And it's suffering at the moment. There's high unemployment. Its moves with North Korea haven't really produced results. There haven't been nuclear tests, but I think if you use that as your measuring stick, it's probably not a good indicator. North Korea quit nuclear missile tests simply because, well, a mountain collapsed on them. So I think Moon, his legacy is going to be very tarred. In Seoul, you'll see protests against Japan, and that's very intentional. Moon's legacy is, it's not where he wants it to be. But considering the last South Korean presidents are either in prison or in a happy retirement, it probably is a better legacy than most.
So just as a final thought then, do you think then, John, that in fact just right-wing leaders in South Korea, or tougher leaders, let me put it this way, in fact, those who are tougher towards North Korea are the ones that will be able to succeed when it comes to peace in the Korean Peninsula? Or do you think that Moon had it right as far as policy goes towards the North, and that he wanted peace and was willing to have that sort of an overture?
Well, you're essentially constrained by what North Korea wants. North Korea holds all the cards. They quit nuclear testing because, well, they had to. But South Korea is still sending food aid to North Korea. But nothing's really fundamentally changed with relations between North and South Korea. North Korea is still belligerent. They still have their internment camps with countless prisoners. They're still launching ballistic missile tests. So any progress is measured by what North Korea wants. And North Korea very much has succeeded in forcing South Korea to make a lot of concessions. But even in Seoul, I think there's a level of I wouldn't say happiness, or there's a level of pleasure about the fact that tensions have been ratcheted down between North and South Korea.
Yeah.
But Moon's legacy isn't necessarily going to be the Korea issue. It's going to be a lot of other issues with Japan and its economy and things like that. So.
Very well, John. We'll leave it there. That is our final thought. But of course, appreciate your time speaking to us there from Seoul today. John Lyman, Editor-in-Chief of International Policy Digest. Viewers, this is, of course, a complex situation, a long-standing situation on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. president, at least on the outside, being critical of South Korea at this time vis-a-vis payments for what he has called U.S. protection, as I put in my introduction, especially when it comes to the context of military drills that happen annually, mind you, between these two nations, something that North Korea has complained about every single time those military drills have happened. Kim Jong-un, even this time now, sending a handwritten letter, apparently, to Donald Trump, as he claims, standing at the White House, and something that he called a beautiful letter, saying that he even agrees that these war games should not continue in this context, and then again complained about South Korea not paying up enough, at least, for this U.S. protection, quote unquote. Will all of this result in peace on the Korean Peninsula, or is it just, as John said, just for public consumption, to save face, really, on the part of Donald Trump, because he came into office wanting some sort of peace on the Korean Peninsula, but that hasn't really played out when it comes to any policies towards the North, i.e. lifting of sanctions or otherwise. We'll keep a close eye on that situation there in the Korean Peninsula here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Donald Trump once again, but this time he's not criticizing South Korea only, he's criticizing the French President, Emmanuel Macron, as well. This time, coming to the Iran nuclear deal and policies over Iran overall, saying that no one is authorized to speak on the part of the United States, and he's accused the French president of then sending mixed signals, quote unquote, to Tehran over any possible talks. And this comes, of course, as we are all aware that there were reports that Macron had invited Rouhani, President Rouhani of Iran, that is, to the G7 summit that is upcoming soon to meet Donald Trump. French diplomats, though, have denied that specific report. However, the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, has in fact responded, saying France is a sovereign country and will do what it feels is in its national interest, and Donald Trump cannot, of course, dictate to France. I'm paraphrasing, of course, parts of his statement there. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Emmanuel Dupuy, who is the president of the Institute for European Perspective and Security. He's joining us now from the French capital. Also joining us from Paris is Kourosh Shamlou, who is an international lawyer, managing partner at Shamlou Law. Kourosh and Emmanuel, thank you both for your time this morning there, speaking to us from Paris. Emmanuel, I'd like to start with you. Is Donald Trump's criticism of Macron legitimate? Is Macron sending mixed signals to Tehran?
Well, I think we have to take in consideration what the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, responded to the tweets of Donald Trump, saying that no one is authorized in any way, shape, or form to represent us, saying that France doesn't need any authorization to speak on Iran for a various number of reasons. First of all, we are a member of the same international organization. We are a member of the P5 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, which in its core authorizes nuclear power and nuclear weapon holders of nuclear weapons to, of course, assess to have a role and a say on that on this vision. And of course, everyone is agreeing that the French mediation, which has been a long-lasting effort. Emmanuel Macron has sent his diplomatic advisor 2 times in Tehran. The special envoy of Iran, Vice Minister Abbas Arashki, came a few days ago in Paris. And of course, everyone is praising, or at least the members of the remaining signatoire of the joint common plan of action, of course, putting aside Great Britain, are praising the role and the capacity and the will of France to mediate that conflict. So I think to wrap up what I was saying is that there is absolutely no reason why we should not discuss with Iran, since we've been assessing the fact that since the July 2015 agreement on nuclear agreement, France, and of course linked to Germany and the European Union, and the other the other signatories are willing to assess and to complement and to implement this agreement.
Okay, so Kourosh, what do you make of this? Because it is confusing, isn't it? Even Donald Trump, in fact, himself can be accused of mixed signals, can't he? Because he's spoken out so strongly against the Iran nuclear deal, yet at the same time he has said he's open to talks with Iran. That in and of itself is mixed signals, isn't it?
Thank you for inviting me. Yes, of course, it's a mixed signal by Donald Trump himself. But just to surprise you, I never agree with Donald Trump. But for one time, I can say that what he said, that it's the U.S. that should speak on behalf of the U.S. government or the U.S. He must be right. President Macron tries to bring the 2 parties together to talk. President Macron has good relation with Donald Trump. At least he thinks he has very good relation with Donald Trump, but nobody has very excellent relation with Donald Trump because nobody knows what he's gonna think the next day. So he's himself sending a lot of mixed messages to Iran, because one day, when Foreign Minister Zarif was in New York at the United Nations, he sent Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, a Republican senator, to discuss with Rand Paul. And a few days after, he put sanctions on Foreign Minister Zarif. So he's playing the good cop, bad cop all the time, so you never know what he's thinking.
All right, so Kourosh, do you think in some of this does prove that there is a huge split between Europe, or the European signatories to the nuclear deal, and the United States?
Of course there is. Because the European Union still agree and still say that Iran complies with all its obligation, and that the United States or the Europeans should not get out of the JCPOA. But the Americans do whatever they want. Europe tries to stand against the United States, but they have no power. They have no political power or economical power to stand against the United States. Because even if the European put in place a law, they put a special purpose vehicle for European companies to invest in Iran. But no European companies will go and invest in Iran unless they have a written agreement from the United States. For example, Peugeot is the biggest car maker in France. They invested in Iran, but as soon as the deal was announced by the American, they got off the deal because they know they cannot face the American. Iran was the second largest market for Peugeot, but still they came out because without the Americans, no deal can be alive.
That's a very good point, isn't it, Emmanuel? Because, as much as Europe tries to show itself as a strong bloc and entity, it does seem, Emmanuel, that especially when it comes to the nuclear deal with Iran, that Europe has actually proven itself to be quite weak.
Well, we're trying not to be weak, and this is again what we have to take in consideration when the proposal of France was to open a 50 billion euros line of credit in regards to the compensation chamber to avoid the U.S. sanction, and of course trying to avoid the use of dollar. And of course, I'm taking the example of the instrument in support of trade exchanges Instex, which was created in January 2019. Of course, we have to assess the fact that Europe is weak, but Europe is not the only player in this perspective. Donald Trump has tweeted that he was very upset about the French negotiation, but didn't he send himself a mixed message when he allowed Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister of Japan, in late June to go to Tehran to try to speak and to open negotiation? I did not hear any discussion about that coming from him. And of course, we do have in mind that other actors are playing this mediation role: Oman, Switzerland, which of course do represent the United States in Tehran, of course, on behalf of us, that they don't have any diplomatic relation for 40 years. Or Germany. So it's a bit easy to put pressure on France, as France is hosting the G7, and this is why it was a good perspective, and I think we should follow up on the idea of maintaining the discussion and maintaining the dialogue with President Hassan Rouhani. This is why President Macron invited him the 24th and 26th of August for the G7. And of course, we have to take into consideration what your previous speaker said, that there is not political weakness, but there is an economical situation which is an unfair situation. This is extraterritoriality, and this is why we're trying, and at least we are following up on a certain number of propositions to have a de-dollarization of economy and to try and to foster and robust our euro, which of course could be a way of implementing more easily, not only when it comes to agribusiness, when it comes to medical activities or humanitarian goods, which are authorized under the prospect of Instex, but of course to tackle and to deal what the Iranians are asking us, because this is what we promised the 14th of July 2015, to allow them to export.
Okay, so Emmanuel, if I may go back to the G7 for a moment, because, you know, the possibility, or do you think, let me put it this way, do you think that there is actually a possibility that Macron will be able to convince both Hassan Rouhani and Donald Trump to actually meet each other at the summit?
Well, I mean, the Iranians have said that they will not come to Biarritz when they was asked officially whether or not this proposition was made. But of course, as I mentioned previously, the mediation and the dialogue is deeper than the only invitation to come to Biarritz. As I mentioned, Emmanuel Macron may be planning to go to Tehran himself. He promised that almost a year ago, but he did not fulfill his promise. Indeed. And there are now some special envoy. French has sent, again, its French presidential diplomatic envoy 2 times. Discussions are going on very strong between the 2 ambassadors, the French ambassador in Tehran and the newly appointed ambassador Iranian ambassador in Paris. Okay. And of course, France is trying, but I think there is not a difference between the position of Jean-Yves Le Drian or the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Heiko Maas, to try to implement and try to save the nuclear agreement.
Okay, so de-dollarization, if we can talk about that for a moment, Kourosh, because, you know, with X and all of these measures, Europe can at least claim on the outside that it has done enough. Do you believe that Europe has actually done enough in this case? Because the Iranians, obviously, as you know well, Kourosh, would point to simple things like, you know, like the deals that they had with airplane makers. We can talk about Airbus, for example, and the genuine Iranian need for newer planes to keep their own population secure when they're traveling just within the country or outside. That's really a human rights issue in many regards, isn't it? Because we're talking about the safety and security of a population. We're not talking about just the government. Do you think Europe will be able to actually come out on top when it comes to such issues and others?
I think at least they're trying to. Europe tried to lead in this matter, and just to say that we are here in order to help the Iranian people, not especially the Iranian government, because the Iranian people is very talented people, and they need help. Just to go back on Instex, what I could tell you, it's like as Emmanuel said, is the Instex is trying to push the companies to use euro and not to use the dollar. And the important economies in the world sees that, even the Americans sees that as a threat, because it will be the first time that international deals will be made not in dollars but in euro.
Yeah.
And if you look at that in a more broad perspective, it can help Europe and other countries because these instincts can be developed for other countries. For example, sanctions on Russia, sanctions on Venezuela, or other countries. So if instincts is put in place and it starts working, it's going to be a threat to the American foreign policy and to the American economic, because it's going to be the first time that the dollar will not be used, and it's going to be euro that will be used in these deals. So Europe is trying. I hope they can. I hope they can get something. As you said, President Macron invited Rouhani to come to France. I doubt he accepts, because even in Iran he's under pressure from the hardliners. They don't want him to go and negotiate with Donald Trump.
Indeed. We'll leave there as our final comment, Kourosh, but we appreciate both Kourosh and Emmanuel for their time speaking to us this morning from the French capital. Viewers, this is an important topic, because if Hassan Rouhani were to, and it would be a miracle really if he were to actually show up in France, considering, as Kourosh there at the end mentioned, he's under immense pressure domestically when it comes to his stances, when it comes to the nuclear deal. It has not worked. And the Iranian economy is suffering severely at this point in time, though some measures have been put in place to at least stem some of the suffering of the Iranian people, those who are suffering because of lack of medicines, etc. Now, at the same time, Europe claiming that it is doing enough. The Iranians would argue, in fact, in that regard, as Arakchi would as well, the Iranian official, that Europe is not doing enough. On top of all of this is Donald Trump and his ego seemingly coming in the way, trying to say that he wants to be the one who holds the cards and doesn't want France or anybody else to hold the cards in trying to save the nuclear deal or otherwise. A complex situation, a lot of mixed messages from all sides. We'll keep a very close eye on how all that plays out in the coming days, months, and years here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, a Hong Kong activist, Joshua Wong Chi-fung, if I'm saying his name correctly, who is Secretary General of a pro-democracy party, says that there was nothing sinister behind him meeting with Julia Ide, who is a political unit chief of the U.S. Consulate General in Hong Kong. Now, obviously, this is an extremely sensitive time in Hong Kong, considering the protest movements and what may very well be called riots by some people, such as Donald Trump, mind you, that this was probably not very good optics at the very least. Why would somebody from a high level at the U.S. Consulate General be meeting with one of the protest leaders or riot leaders, however you want to term it, there in Hong Kong? Does this show collusion, as, of course, many people have said? Let's discuss this a bit further. We're now joined by Einar Tangen, who is a political and economic affairs commentator. He's joining us now from Beijing. Joining us from Hong Kong itself is Andrew Leung, who is international and independent China strategist. Andrew and Einar, thank you both for your time today. Andrew, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this meeting that took place? The Americans claiming, listen, we meet opposition leaders all the time, but in this specific context of what's occurring in Hong Kong, this was a bad decision all around, wasn't it?
As you said, it's very, very sensitive time in Hong Kong. This meeting coming as it did, amongst a wave of protests, and then causing huge disruption. But also, these protests are targeting symbols of Beijing's authority, symbols of the government's authority, and is now giving the impression that it's all the hallmarks of a color revolution in Hong Kong. And indeed, the Beijing, in the recent press conference in Beijing, the Hong Kong-Macau Affairs Office, a rare press conference, in fact, 2 consecutive press conferences, make references to the appearances of a color revolution. And of course, there were suspicions that the frontline activists and militants who use sometimes lethal implements to provoke the police, and also took a very active part in vandalizing police stations and so on and so forth, appear to be reasonably trained in advance, because they know how to deal with tear gas, and they have managed the supply lines across the sea of protesters extremely well. And then, of course, the question of funding. There was also admission on Fox News by the National Endowment for Democracy, which of course is an NGO in the United States, United States being a democratic country, of course promoting civil disobedience techniques around the world for a long, long time. And then reports saying that the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, is also funding some of the activist groups in Hong Kong, and not only this time around, but also during the previous umbrella movement.
Very good points that you brought up, Andrew. If you allow me, I wanted to get Einar's thoughts on that, because Einar, to many of us around the world, sometimes these things sound very conspiratorial, don't they? But do you think that there's actually a lot of genuine concern here that the U.S. would, in fact, be colluding with these protest leaders, militants, however you want to term them? And this is certainly not the only place in the world this has happened. As Andrew there correctly pointed out, we can possibly talk even about Ukraine, other countries as well, where possibly the U.S. has done this exact same thing.
Well, quite frankly, Venezuela comes to mind as we start talking about it. So at this point, it's really, the optics of it. Let's go back and put it in context. You had the founder of the Democratic Movement Party in Hong Kong meeting with who? Pence, Bolton, all right, Pompeo, members of Congress, indicating that he wanted to, soliciting their support for a free Hong Kong. So when you start looking at that, and then you start looking at this meeting, these follow-up meetings with Joshua Wong, and the fact that there is so much money that's obviously coming in. Now, at this point, there's this claim that there are no leaders who are directing all these things. Yet when you start looking at the tactics that they're using, they're obviously very coordinated, very sophisticated. Somehow somebody has to pass out these hard hats. They have to pass out the gas masks. They have to pass out the literature. They have to get people to and from different places. They're not going to one place. Last week, they went 7 different areas. That takes a lot of coordination. So China is looking at this as a funded effort to put full pressure on it by the U.S. U.S. is sailing ships to the Taiwan Straits. It's going near to disputed islands in the South China Sea. It has a trade war going on. It is attacking Chinese companies like Huawei, ZTE, for what they claim is, being infiltration units of the Chinese government. So you add it all up, and it would be, not unbelievable to see that the U.S. is trying to light a fire in Hong Kong, and that their concern is not about democracy there, but simply as another means of creating pressure. And Donald Trump has not been a crusader of any type in terms of human rights or anything like that. He simply is all about the end game.
Okay, so I wonder what Andrew's thoughts are on that, because Joshua Wong would then turn around and say, and as he did, defending himself, he said, listen, I've even traveled to the U.S., so why would this be a big deal? And secondly, he said that the discussion with Julie Ide was based on what's called the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which is a bill that's being proposed in the U.S. Congress, and that calls for involvement in safeguarding, quote-unquote, democracy in Hong Kong. Is that an innocent endeavor on the part of Joshua?
Yeah, I'd like to add that not only the meeting between Joshua Wong and the senior members of the U.S. consulate, but also an earlier meeting with the founder of the Apple Daily, which is, of course, Hong Kong's main newspaper, supporting and also greatly encouraging these protests, and also the Apple Daily was known to be backing the umbrella movement, and the founder of the Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai, met Pompeo. So he's only a newspaper founder, and then he was given such a high-level audience in the United States in recent weeks. So this suggests that gives the Beijing real concern, and also plus the fact that quite recently there were two findings of cost of high explosives earlier on. I mean, there were one type of explosive, the TAPT, is commonly used by terrorists around the world, and then. So this feeds into the suspicion that there's more than ordinary protest, because while there's a genuine groundswell of the satisfaction and the passion of the young students, that's all genuine. But on the other hand, it seems to be hijacked by exterior forces to turn this into something of a color revolution, trying to provoke Beijing in deploying the People's Liberation Army. Because once the Liberation Army is deployed, then the one country, two system will be seen to be totally failed. And then there would be opportunities for sanctions against China and would drag China down. Plus the fact, of course, it would present a golden opportunity for currency speculators to make money out of this fiasco. So I think that Beijing is extremely worried and extremely cautious, and now adopting a policy of stabilizing everything first, regardless, before addressing some of the deep-seated kind of social problems confronting this implementation of the one country, two systems.
Einar, it's interesting because, Einar, it seems that Donald Trump not on the same page as the rest of the U.S. establishment when it comes to policies towards Hong Kong, is he? Because he's actually distanced himself from the situation, saying that last week that the Hong Kong situation was for China to resolve because Hong Kong is a part of China. That's an exact quote of what he said. And then he also called the protests riots. Again, of course, going more along with what Beijing has described the protests as. So what should we understand from that? Do you think that there is behind the scenes a dispute really within the Trump administration about how to approach Hong Kong's issue? And then what is the U.S. president's actual stance on all this, do you think?
Well, quite frankly, Donald Trump has used this ploy before. He always tries to, play the good cop, bad cop. He'll have the administration administer, all these different plans, or say they're going to go to war or go on the opposite side. He likes to be on the other side of his own administration, and you can see that consistently throughout his presidency. And this gives him deniability. So if he does meet Xi Jinping, he can say, I thought that was terrible, blah, blah, blah. My guys, they're anxious. I'll take care of you. It's his kind of approach to things. This is this art of the deal, where he tries to insert his personality and his own skill sets as the key linchpin to any kind of situation. We all know that his ultimate goal is not the protection of Hong Kong, which I doubt he knows much about other than having traveled there, but really this trade deal that he thinks with China, that he thinks would propel him into a second term at the White House.
That's a very good point to end off on. We'll leave there as our final thought. Einar and Andrew, thank you both for your time and, of course, your expert insight today. Viewers, this situation when it comes to Hong Kong, with this video that has come out of Joshua Wong, Secretary General of a pro-democracy party there, and one of the protest leaders, main protest leaders, mind you, as well as Julie Ide, a political unit chief at the U.S. Consulate General in Hong Kong, certainly raises a lot of alarms, because this sort of play card and playbook has been seen before by the U.S. elsewhere in the world, hasn't it? From Ukraine to, as Einar mentioned, Venezuela as well, and other places in the world where the U.S. is heavily involved, really, in what it calls promoting democracy, but certainly it's not just about promoting democracy, it's just about going after those who disagree with the U.S. policies, and the U.S. always trying to pressurize them in some way or the other. Even examples from Iran, possibly in 2009, can be brought up also about possible color revolutions or at least prospective color revolutions at some point. Is the U.S. innocent in this case, or are we making too much of this video at this time, as Joshua says? What of that bill that is being put at the U.S. Congress? Will that pass in the U.S. Congress? And what does that then mean for China-U.S. relations going forward? As in the context, of course, as you must remember, with the trade talks and even talks between North Korea and the U.S. This can muddy all those waters. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation here in Scope. I'm Waqar Rizvi. Thanks very much for watching.